this. Go.
I'm sorry, I just had to play that video, and you'll see why. It actually doesn't have anything to do with the 76ers. It actually exposes one of the biggest problems the Celtics have this season. So the Celtics are 19-5. They're the best record in the East, and they're probably going to be the favorites to win the East this year. But they did one thing last season that I think everyone is forgetting. And that's actually trade Marcus Smart. Now, they ended up getting back Christophe Porzingis, which is actually a really good trade for them, and he's been playing pretty well for them this year, and it's been helping them. One thing people forget is that because they lost Marcus Smart, they lost their identity. They lost that toughness that they had, at least in previous years. And that's something that's going to bite them back in the playoffs, especially the leadership part of Marcus Smart. Because Tatum and Brown, are they really like the best leaders? Are they really vocal leaders and stuff like that? No one really thinks of them as that. Maybe they are behind the scenes and we just don't know, but no one really thinks of that. And then obviously we get into the coach, Joe Mazzulla. There's a ton of controversy with him. I'm sure there's so many people in the Boston media who, hate him. I'm sure I could find a bunch of Boston radio clips of people just ranting about him all the time. But Joe Mazzulla, I wouldn't say it was that bad last year, but for a team that needs to, be a championship contender, he made a lot of mistakes in the playoffs. Like, you can't go down 0-4 when you're the much higher seed and you're playing essentially a team that barely stuck in the playoffs and barely snuck past the play-in tournament. Like, come on, that just can't happen. There's still this question that everyone's going to have about the Celtics. Is Joe Mazzulla really the coach that's good enough to push them over the top in the playoffs? Now, there's going to be a lot of varying opinions about this, but I really just don't think so. Now, that being said, Joe Mazzulla and the Celtics actually do have a lot going for them. Obviously, they're a great team, very, very talented, a great starting five. And the biggest thing that I would say is that in the playoffs, they don't really have to compete against a lot of experienced top-tier coaches. I mean, the only guy who has experience and been there is Nick Nurse. All the other guys, obviously, the Bucks have a new coach. The Magic don't really have a coach that you're going to think that's going to scare someone in the playoffs. But I think the only coach you really have to worry about is that out-scheme you is maybe like Nick Nurse. But what I really do worry about is how is Joe Mazzulla going to manage late games? Like, is he going to keep the adequate amount of timeouts? And is he going to set up good plays out of those timeouts? And most importantly, is he going to rely on Jason Tatum and Jalen Brown? Or is he just going to use the strength of their team, their starting five, and play selfish-less basketball? And essentially, is that how they're going to play even in the final stretches of games? That's something I think is going to be really interesting to see how Joe Mazzulla actually plays this out once the postseason starts. But I'd say that's probably the biggest knock against Joe Mazzulla, or the biggest topic of contention, is the amount of threes the Celtics are taking. Like, let me just hit you up with these facts right here. The Celtics average 43 three-point attempts per game, which is the second most in the league. They average 30% on those threes, which is around really league average. I believe it's 15th or 16th. They only take 46 shots inside the arc per game, which is, I think, at least top 5 worst in the league, which is not really what you want, depending on what style you want to play, obviously. But for some reason, they're actually top 3 in terms of inside of the arc efficiency. So it just kind of contradicts itself. Like, why are they taking so many threes? Obviously, it's not that independent. I mean, I'm sure the fact that they're taking so many threes gets them a lot of easy buckets inside the arc, inside the lane, and stuff like that. But is this really a strategy that's efficient in the playoffs? I mean, that's something we'll see. But another thing I also want to get into is that it doesn't seem like they're that aggressive as a team. Their league average around free throws per game, which for a team that's the best in the East, you would expect at least more from them. Now, obviously, they're moving less shots inside the arc, so that's going to happen. But I also think that fouls and getting to the free throw line is really, really important because it slows down the game. You can get the opponent's best players, or at least some of their best players. You can get them in foul trouble. And when you're really just so reliant on the three, it's kind of harder. Like, refs aren't going to really reward you. You're not going to get it. You're not going to get the other team into foul territory. You're not going to get into the penalty and stuff like that. But what's really also really interesting is why do they even employ the strategy? Like, I gotta be honest, like, the strategy of these teams always taking so many three-pointers, like, three-pointers are amazing. If you can't spread the floor, you're not gonna do well in the NBA. That's a given fact. This is 2023. It's not gonna work. But I think one fallacy about three-pointers is that analytically it says that you should take more three-pointers, but that's not actually true. And I don't understand why, like, the media and everyone just, like, pushes this narrative. Because let me just give you this situation. It's a lot more gray than just black and white. It's simply you take more threes, you're going to be more efficient offense. That's not how it works. Let's say I have a 12-foot jump shot and I'm completely wide open. You would expect, let's say, an NBA player to have, like, what, 65% chance to make that shot. So if you do some basic math here, you would expect per possession, if you get a great wide open 12-foot jump shot, you would expect to get like 1.3 points per possession. You'll see what I'm getting at the end. I'm taking a very contested 3-point shot, which it's, let's say it's there's a player, the hand is right in my face. It's gonna be really difficult to get that shot over the player. Let's say that shot, you'd say it's a 35% chance. Let's say you have a pretty good shooter, 35% chance to make that in. You would expect that if that's the shot you're getting, you'd expect what, 0.35 times 3. You'd expect, well, it's roughly 1 point per possession. So taking the open mid-range shot is actually more efficient analytically than taking the 3-point shot, which is why I don't really understand why some teams, like especially those old Rocket teams, with Mike D'Antoni, why they were so reliant on the three-point shot. Like, the mid-range still has a lot of value. Like, obviously, if you know the game, it obviously has a lot of value, but even statistically, it has a lot of value. So while, yeah, there are a lot of problems with analytics, I wouldn't say that the three-point shot and what Joe Mazzulla's strategy here is really analytically driven. There's probably a bunch of other reasons why he does it, but I just don't agree. Like, I don't think it's going to work in the playoffs, which I think is the much bigger point. Like, in the playoffs, the game's going to slow down. You're going to have a lot of people that are going to essentially try to run the Celtics off the three-point line. You're going to essentially make other guys beat you, which is like you make Al Horford, make White, make a bunch of those players try to make them beat you instead of Tatum or Brown. We'll see if the strategy works in the playoffs. I kind of don't think it's going to work. I think the fact that they're not experienced, getting fouled. I mean, they already can't get fouls in the regular season. How are they going to get whistles in the postseason? It's going to be pretty difficult. So I would say that this strategy overall isn't going to work, but we'll see. I could be proven wrong. But there's something that I had to talk about, the elephant in the room, which is, do the Celtics miss Ime Udoka? Now, obviously, if you have that entire Ime Udoka fiasco, I'm not going to get into that, I don't think, and I don't want to get into that. And obviously, I do completely understand why the Celtics fired him. It makes sense. But you just got to think about it. Would the Celtics really be in this position right now where they're the #1 seed in the East and people really don't truly believe that they're going to win the finals? Would people be thinking that with Ime Udoka? I completely doubt it. I mean, yeah, they're the #1 seed and Joe Mazzulla has done a pretty good job, but let's face it, we all have some serious doubts about this team. Whether you're a Celtics fan or whether you're not, like, this team, despite being 19-5, they have a lot of flaws. So when you see someone like Ime Udoka essentially take a Rockets team, make them above 500, playing really competitively, obviously they have a ton of talent, not as much as the Celtics obviously, but they have a lot of talent. They've been really bad for a lot of years. They have a lot of young talent, Jalen Green, obviously they got Fred VanVleet, and they even got Dylan Brooks, who a lot of people don't like. I think he provides a lot outside of his game, off the field. And obviously inside the game, he's a really tenacious player. He plays with a lot of intensity, which can sometimes get him in trouble. But I do think there's a lot of value in this game. And he's been playing really well this year. And I think the Grizzlies actually miss him a lot. It's not just Ja Morant. It's not the only reason why that team sucks right now. But I don't know. When you have people in Houston who say that, Joe Mazzulla might be one of the best coaches in the league, if not the best coach in the league, it just makes you wonder as a Celtics fan, what could have been if that fiasco just never happened. But then we have the real elephant in the room. And that's Jason Tatum. Like, we've had this conversation about him so many times. So many people have this conversation. But is he really the guy that can take the Celtics to a championship team? Is he really a #1 on a championship contender? I know this debate, infuriates people on both sides. Like, there's some people who just think he's so overrated. He cannot be a #1 on the team. There's some people who's like, he's a top 5 player in the NBA. Now, I'm a bit more nuanced into that. And while I do think he's definitely a bit overrated, I do think he can be a #1 on a championship team. But there are levels to being a #1 on a championship team. Like, he's only a #1 on a championship team in my eyes because that team was just so loaded. Now, obviously, the Celtics bench has a bit to be worried about, but they have a great starting 5. So for a team like that, Jason Tatum can be the best player. But there's going to be a time where that best player has to come up clutch in the playoffs. And while you can say that point to a bunch of performances in the playoffs where Jason Tatum has played well, I'll be honest here. As a Sixers fan, if the Sixers just weren't so bad at choking, people would be thinking of the Celtics as the biggest chokers in the NBA. Like, there are so many times where Tatum just played flat out poorly and terrible against the Sixers in those series, but the Sixers are just playing so bad that it just goes under the rug and he ends up winning. So I would say that the Celtics are actually one of the biggest chokers in the NBA. Like, the Sixers being so bad and choking so much has given the Celtics such a good pass by the media. Like, you gotta understand, this team has had so much talent throughout the years, and they've just been finding up ways to come up small. Now, obviously, not a lot of that is on Tatum. You have those Kyrie Irving teams and that entire fiasco with him, and then Kemba Walker, a lot of stuff with that. But Tatum has been the one constant in all of that. And obviously, I'm not counting that rookie stuff with Kyrie against him, but it just seems like every year we wait for Tatum to be the guy, and that team just in general, and part of it is his fault, just ends up coming up small with such great talent. And one of the reasons why I feel like that team comes up small is that I feel like there are times where they just get a bunch of great players and they just think it's automatically going to fit. Like this year, they added Porzingis to his team. Now, I actually do think Porzingis is actually a pretty good fitter in this team, although I feel like trading away Marcus Smart, while it definitely makes sense if you look at Marcus Smart versus Porzingis, and if you look at that trade, it definitely makes sense for the Celtics, but I just feel like Marcus Smart is a lot more valuable than people think. But we'll see if the Celtics team fits or not. Like, I think that's going to be one of the biggest factors down the stretch, is we can see if they can really build proper chemistry throughout the season, and if they can, then they have a chance to go out and win it all. But if not, you're going to get the same Celtics team that you talk about every single year. The one gets hyped up, and then eventually they crash in the playoffs. Just like those Sixers teams, but just not as worse. But don't let that fool you. They are almost like the Sixers.